Welcome to FPB's Meet the Candidates. This Cable 10 series allows you, the viewer, the voter, to hear directly from our candidates about issues that are important to us. This is all leading up to the general election, which is on November 6th. Today's guest is Judge Rob Johnson, and he's running for a seat on the Kentucky Court of Appeals, 5th Appellate District, Division 1. Welcome, Judge Johnson. I'm glad to have you here. I thought maybe we'd start out with you telling us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. I'm Rob Johnson, and I'm currently sitting as a judge on the Kentucky Court of Appeals. I've been there since March of 2017, and before that was the circuit court judge for Bourbon, Scott, and Woodford counties. Did that from 2005 till 2017, so about 12 years. And during that same time period, as I was a circuit court judge for those three counties, I was also the chief regional circuit judge for the Bluegrass region. That's an appointment by the Chief Justice of Kentucky, and also selected by my colleagues as the chief judge of the circuit court for Bourbon, Scott, and Woodford County. So mainly those are administrative responsibilities, but that's kind of what I did. Married to Rebecca Johnson. We've been married for over 25 years. And we have 5 children, Benjamin, Sam, Caleb, Hannah, and Beth. The oldest is Benjamin, he's 20, and the youngest is Beth, she's 9.
Oh, wow.
So they keep us pretty active. They keep us pretty crazy, especially during the campaign season, although it's pretty beneficial. The older two, the older two are in college. But now we've kind of raised the new group to help us out. My wife is actually the county clerk in Scott County.
Oh, okay.
And so the older two got to help her a lot more when she was running for her in her elections. But now we're kind of raising the new crop. But anyway, so that's I don't know, a little bit about me.
Okay. So what inspired you to run for this seat? And I know that you're sitting in it right now. And tell us how that came about and then why you've chosen to run for it.
Sure. Well, excuse me. Judge, now Justice Van Meter, used to be the sitting judge in my seat on the Kentucky Court of Appeals for the First Division. And I don't know if you remember this or not, but about 2 years ago, you probably do, he won his seat on the Kentucky Supreme Court. So that left a vacancy at the Court of Appeals. And so the way we fill those vacancies in the court system is the Chief Justice announces the vacancy, and so anybody that's interested in getting an appointment to that position fills out an application, turns it in to the Chief Justice, and then the way the Chief Justice does it is first of all, there's a commission. And so that commission is comprised of 4 people from across the state. It's a little different in the appellate commission because each of the circuit judges, if there's a vacancy, it gets appointed the commission is just made up of those people from that particular circuit. Okay. But on the appellate district, the appellate level, it's actually comprised of people from all across the state. And so there's 4 people on the commission, 4 lay people. In my situation, 2 were appointed by Governor Beshear, 2 were appointed by Governor Bevin. Okay. And then there were 2 attorneys that were elected by the Bar Association. Oh, okay. And then the Chief Justice of Kentucky sits on the commission. And so they meet, they actually have interviews with all the candidates. I think I don't know exactly how many there were. I've heard there were more than 15, but a good number of candidates. And so then they select the top 3 that they decide to go ahead and, that they believe would do the best job. And they send those names to the governor. And then the governor chooses from those 3 names. And that's how I was chosen. I was appointed by the governor back in 2017. And like I said, I've now been there since March of 2017.
Excellent. So for some people who may not know, what are the responsibilities of the Court of Appeals?
Sure. Well, as a Court of Appeals judge, basically I sit on 3-judge panel that's comprised of 14. The way this works is there's 14 appellate judges on the Court of Appeals from across the state. There's 2 from each of the 7 appellate districts. And so we sit in 3-judge panels. And what we do is we review the cases mainly from circuit court. There are some workers' comp cases that we get, and there are occasionally some cases that we take from district court where they've asked us to review the decisions of the circuit court judge and how they reviewed those. But basically we hear appeals from circuit court in which they and from circuit court, there's criminal cases that are felony criminal cases, which means jail time's at least a year. And then you have the civil cases that are over $5,000. And one other thing that we hear on the Court of Appeals that not all circuit judges get to hear, local here to Franklin County, of course, is that if there's any state cases from the administrative agencies, they're generally appealed here in Franklin County. And so the other thing that we do on the Court of Appeals is hear appeals from the Franklin Circuit Court and some of those cases as well. So those are generally the types of cases, civil cases. We also hear from the family court cases, custody, divorce, distribution of property. So those are other types of cases. But basically, we sit on a 3-judge panel, and each of us has to review the law. We all have to make a decision from the briefs. In some cases, we have oral arguments where we ask questions of the attorneys about some of the issues that they raise in their briefs. But ultimately, based upon what the law is, we have to make a decision whether, first of all, there's sufficient facts from the trial level that there was sufficient evidence to make a decision there that they made, and also that the law is correct. And so we review those, what's called de novo, but basically we just decide whether or not they interpret the law properly.
I see. And how long is the judge's term?
The circuit court judges, Court of Appeals judges, and Supreme Court justices all have 8-year terms. Now, this is the remainder of Judge Van Meter's 8-year term.
I see.
So really, there's only 4 years left on this term after the November election.
I see.
So then I'll be reelected. So then I would be reelected in 2022 as well.
Gotcha. So, in the middle of a campaign and then having to be reelected, do you consider yourself a politician?
You know, it is strange. I don't know that I don't know that I've ever considered myself a politician, quite honestly. I mean, before I was circuit judge back in 2005, I've also sat on the Georgetown City Council. I was elected 2 terms to the Georgetown City Council. And I don't even know if I considered myself a politician then. I mean, I just consider myself someone who works for the people, and even on the council tries to make the best decision. Of course, as a judge, you know, the reason I answer that question is not being a politician. You know, my job as a judge is to interpret the law, not to create the law. It's not to decide what I want the result to be, and then decide, okay, so here's the law, so I can get to that result. And so my job is to interpret the law as it's written, strictly, and then from there you reach a decision. And I think that's an important distinction because there are some differences in the way judges do things.
Well, you have to find a balance between being an independent judge and an elected official. So what's the best way to go about doing that?
Well, like I said, I mean, the best way is to not look for result first. The best way is I see the law, when I make my decisions, it's kind of like a puzzle. What I'm doing is I'm putting the pieces together. So whether I'm looking at the Constitution, of course that's the ultimate authority, or whether I'm looking at a statute from the legislature or some previous case law from previous appellate decisions, I have to look at each of those things and read them very clearly, read them very concisely to make sure that I understand what they say, and then I put those pieces together, and that gives me the result, the puzzle, and that gives you the decision, the case. And so some people, again, and it's really important too for judges not to be political. It's because we're the branch that is supposed to be, to give fairness, to make the decision that's right in a specific case. So we're required to evenly carry out the law.
Okay. Do judges have an obligation to improve public understanding of the courts? And if so, how should they carry out that obligation?
Well, to answer your question, yes. Judges do have an obligation to do that. And I can only tell you the ways in which I've done it.
Sure.
And during the last year and a half that I've been on the Court of Appeals, instead of just having all of our oral arguments in our Court of Appeals courtroom here in Frankfort, and we've actually gone out to the classrooms and had our oral arguments. So for example, in Scott County, they have what's called Elkhorn Crossing School, which has a law and justice department there. And so we've gone to their actual courtroom there at the school, and we've had our oral argument. So the students there had an opportunity to see real attorneys in action arguing to real judges, and got to see how those cases are argued. We did the same thing at Eastern Kentucky University. We've also been to the new Frederick Douglass High School in Lexington. I've also been to the technical school in Jessamine County, and also been to Asbury University. And so that's one way in which I felt like it was good to try to help students understand about our court system and understand kind of how the system works. In addition to that, though, one of the other responsibilities as judges, and this is not paid, this is not part of our actual job, but just one of the things that we do, is we go to seminars and we talk to people about this is what the law is, this is what we do as Court of Appeals judges. I've been to, in addition to going to some of those seminars, and some of those have been for judges, some of those have been for attorneys. But we, go to Rotary clubs and talk to them about the Court of Appeals and let them know what our responsibility is as judges on the Kentucky Court of Appeals. Try to touch different groups like that so they can understand. And it's kind of funny because when I started going to a few of these things, I kind of expected everybody just kind of start falling asleep when they start hearing about the court system, when they start thinking, oh, this is what a judge does. Oh, okay.
I've been in some of those meetings.
Trying to stay awake here. But no, in all reality, it's been really good. I mean, I've gotten a lot of good feedback from different people in some of those organizations, the classrooms. They genuinely seemed like they really were interested in what we did and how we did it. They've asked a lot of questions, and so it's been a really good experience.
Oh, good. So what do you perceive as the greatest obstacles to justice, if any?
Obstacles or?
Obstacles.
Obstacles. The court system has never been cheap. I think that's probably a fair statement from the very beginning. And so one of the obstacles is being able to afford to be a party to an action, and I understand that totally. But I'll say this: I mean, our system is built up so that in the criminal realm, we do have public defenders who are able to represent people who are not able to pay for their own representation. On the civil side, I know that the Kentucky Supreme Court has been working really hard with access to justice to try to help spawn some more entities that will be there to help people who can't afford to be in the court system. So if you have a case in which you're a tenant and you're involved in a landlord-tenant case, or if you're in a domestic violence situation, to try to make sure that there's more funds to help people in those types of situations. Another thing that you can do in the civil rights cases, in most of those statutes, there are statutes that allow for attorney's fees. And that's one thing that judges have to look at when they're presiding in those cases, is awarding those attorney's fees. And if you've got a good claim and you've been able to win your claim, then I think it's incumbent upon judges to award those attorney's fees so that there'll be more attorneys more interested in taking those types of cases so that people's rights are protected.
So how do you define injustice, and how do you deal with injustice when you come across it in your courtroom?
Well, the first way I would define injustice is when you have a situation where a judge is looking for a result before they actually look at what the law is. I don't go into any of my cases thinking this is what I want the result to be. That's just not the way I think a judge should handle a case. As a matter of fact, when Justice Gorsuch was being interviewed as he was looking to be on the U.S. Supreme Court, he made a pretty clear statement that he doesn't think that you're a good judge if you like all of your results. And I agree with that. I really do. I believe that I've had several decisions when I don't necessarily like the conclusion I come to, but that's not my job to like the conclusion. My job is to apply the law fairly and evenly. And I think in that way, that's where you get justice. And if it's not done that way, that's injustice.
Well, do you ever wake up in the middle of the night and thinking about a case and then think maybe you made a wrong decision about something?
Honestly, that's been a question on the survey.
Has it?
and I had to give that some thought. I've had a chance to give that one a little thought, honestly. And I really haven't. Even as I feel very comfortable with my knowledge of the law. I feel comfortable that when I issue an opinion, especially on the Court of Appeals, because we have time to read the briefs, we have time to read the cases that are submitted, we have time to do our own legal research, and I don't issue an opinion if I don't think it's the right opinion. And so, honestly, now that's not to suggest that I haven't had cases as a trial attorney where things kind of kept me up at night. I've been involved in several murder cases as the judge, of course, in which I had to preside, and sometimes the facts in those cases are pretty disturbing.
Disturbing, sure.
And so as a judge, I had to, so for example, I had a case from Bourbon County where a 6-year-old boy was killed in a garage by his grandfather's friend. And at the time, my own children, my 3 boys, were 6, 8, and 10. And I had to hear the testimony about what happened to this poor 6-year-old child. But as a judge, it's your responsibility to be fair.
Sure.
And so you have to put your emotions away. And you have to hear those facts. You have to hear the evidence. You have to be able to make sure that the decisions you make are fair and just. Because that's what our system's built on. So.
Okay. What has been your greatest accomplishment in your legal career?
My biggest accomplishment in my legal career? Well, I think being a judge on the Court of Appeals is a pretty big accomplishment. I don't come from a family of attorneys. That's not to suggest that people that have a lot of attorneys in their family that there's anything wrong with that. But I guess my point though is my parents are teachers, educators. My grandparents are educators, farmers. And so I was really the first attorney in my family. And so, to be the youngest sitting circuit judge in the state, not coming from a family of attorneys, not having all that legal experience within the family, and now being a judge on the Kentucky Court of Appeals, I've been really blessed, and I've been fortunate. Worked hard, but also blessed.
Good. Do you believe the current system for disciplining judges is effective?
I think it's important for judges to be held accountable. When they're not, when they do something that's not ethical.
Sure.
And our current system allows for other judges and citizens to review the complaints of people who have issues and assert complaints. And they do that in private initially, but if after reviewing those complaints they believe that there's a reason to go forward, then they will issue charges, and those charges then become public. So I think I do agree that the current system is fair. It's comprised of not only, like I said, a district judge, a circuit judge, a Court of Appeals judge, but it's also comprised of citizens that get to hear these complaints and get to understand what's going on. The chair of that commission is an attorney, which is kind of probably strange because you have an attorney that chairs a commission made up of judges.
Sure.
But I think probably that's fair, so that it's not just judges leading the way. It's someone with some legal experience, and so. And of course, all that's overseen by the Kentucky Supreme Court.
Sure.
They have the final say. So.
While serving on the bench, do you believe you have a role in bringing important legal or judicial issues before the legislature? Why or why not? And what should your role be?
Well, judges generally have to be very careful about the way in which they get involved in political matters. But our rules do allow us to get involved in matters that affect the judiciary. And so to answer your question, yeah, absolutely. I think it's important for judges to let the legislators know these are some of the needs that we have. These are some of the, you mentioned, or we talked about briefly access to justice. I mean, these are things that legislatures need to be aware of. I've been very active as a circuit judge, not as much in the last year and a half because of all the responsibilities and
Sure.
other things going on. But in expungement seminars for people that have been convicted of felonies, and talking with some legislators about how the ability to expunge records of people that have proven themselves after a period of time has been beneficial to families in those situations. So, again, to answer your question, I think there is a role for judges in that part of the process. I think it's a limited role. We have to be careful because we don't want, you don't want to feel like you don't want to overstep yourself and that you're getting involved in a situation where you feel like there's some sort of you're basically getting into something that maybe judges shouldn't get into.
Okay. So to what extent do you believe that a judge should or should not defer to the actions of a legislature?
Well, I believe strongly that the legislature is the elected body that sets policy for specifically our state. Obviously, that's only subject to our Constitution. I think it's the role of the judge not to make the law. It's important that the judge only interpret the law.
Okay.
And that the only time that a judge would have an issue regarding what the actual statute says is if someone brings a constitutional challenge and we have to determine whether or not it's constitutional. But I do believe it's important to strictly interpret the law, and I definitely believe that it's the legislature that's the policy-making body, not the judicial branch.
Okay. Are there specific ways you would improve processes within the Court of Appeals?
There are some things that we do. So for example, the family cases that we have that come before us. I mean, our court has worked very hard to expedite those cases. We actually have a system where if it's a family law case and it involves custody and the other types of issues like that those cases are fast-tracked. And when I say that, what that means is the briefing time is less, so that the attorneys get their briefs in quicker. Generally, we don't require mediation at that point because that would slow down the process, unless, of course, the attorneys would ask for that. But usually we require mediation at the beginning in most cases before we would hear them. But in those cases, we don't necessarily require it. And then as judges, they're marked with an expedited number so that we know these are family cases and we know we got to put them at the top of our docket to try to get those cases out quicker.
Okay.
So that would be an example of where I think our process, can we do it quicker as much as possible? Yeah, sure. If we can find out some more ways to make them go through quicker. But again, we have to, these aren't quick processes because attorneys have the right, the parties have the right, to prepare their briefs, to prepare their arguments, and we have to make sure we have sufficient time to go ahead and get our decisions so that we've got the proper decisions. The other thing too is I think sometimes people don't fully realize about the Court of Appeals. We hear all the appeals that come from circuit court. The only exception would be where there's jail time of 20 years to life. Those go straight to the Kentucky Supreme Court.
Okay.
But otherwise, every other appeal we are required to hear. As opposed to the Kentucky Supreme Court that basically has the ability to choose the cases they hear. They get to choose from amongst the ones they feel like they want to weigh in on. But we actually have panels of 3 judges, and each panel gets about 30 cases a month. If you think about that, that's a lot of work for a panel to get out basically a decision every single day to get our work to meet our workload. And some of those decisions aren't short. I mean, some of those decisions are 10 pages. Some of those decisions, I've seen some over 50 pages. And so to think that we're required to get one out almost every single day of the month, every single day of the year, that's a pretty good workload. And so those are things I hope that people understand when they're talking about shortening up the time. But again, we do have things that we think are really important.
Right. My last question for you, and then I'll let you take over. What is your general judicial philosophy?
I'm what you would call a constitutionalist. And we've kind of alluded to it too already a couple times
Sure, yeah.
during the course of the interview, but I'm a strict constructionist.
Yeah.
Again, I think it's the responsibility of a judge to strictly interpret the law based upon the words that are there. So whether it's the Constitution or whether it's a statute that's passed by the legislature, it's our responsibility to make sure that we strictly interpret that law, and not to decide what you want the result to be before you understand what the law is and then apply the law. So that would be, some people call that originalist, I guess. Some people call those different things. But I just call it a constitutionalist, and like I said, I strictly interpret the law. I think that quite honestly, that's actually if you think about it, that's actually the most fair way to do it, because if you do it in a different way, it's hard for attorneys to always know what the conclusion is going to be in a case. Yeah. It's hard for an attorney to advise their clients, this is what the law is, if you go in front of a judge that sometimes changes it based upon what the result they want.
Yeah.
It's much more structured and much more required within our system to do it in a way which I feel like I handle it. So.
Okay. That's great. I'm going to give you the opportunity now to look in that camera and address our voters directly and tell them why you're the best candidate for this position and why they should vote for you on November 6th.
Okay, thank you. Mm-hmm. First of all, I appreciate the opportunity to first of all be here and get to speak to people in Frankfort and Franklin County. I talked a lot about some of the things that I think are important, but ultimately the question is, why are you the best candidate? And I would first of all indicate that I am a strict constructionalist. If you want someone who's going to keep the law consistent and interpret it in a fair and evenly way, then I would be someone that you would want to vote for. I have already been on the Court of Appeals now for 1.5 years, so I've also have published decisions that have numerous published decisions that are already out there, and I've been a circuit court judge for over 12 years, so I know a lot of the types of cases that come to the Court of Appeals. I've already presided on many of those cases, whether it's murder cases, bad faith claims, personal injury claims, all the many different types of cases that come to circuit court. I've already sat on many of those cases, and I think one thing that I stand out compared to my opponent is that I have not been reversed from a trial by final appellate decision, and so that's something that, the most important things we do as a trial court is have trials, and we have to make decisions on an instantaneous basis. And so from that, like I said, I've been able to do that in a good and fair way, and do it in the proper way. And finally, I share your Kentucky values, the values that we all hold dear as Kentuckians. I share those values, and those are with me when I'm making my decisions on the Kentucky Court of Appeals. So I ask you for your vote on November the 6th to continue to be your Kentucky Court of Appeals judge.
Thank you. And if folks want to learn more about you, where can they find more information?
Go to keepjudgerobjohnson.com.
Gotcha. Thank you.
I'm also on Facebook, by the way.
Well, again, we appreciate you coming by. I know our viewers appreciate hearing directly from our candidates, so thank you so much. And to our viewers, I want to remind you to get out and vote on November 6th. And when you're done voting, go home and tune in to Channel 10, where we'll be bringing you live election coverage from the county clerk's office. It's election season, people, so it's time to get informed and then go voice your choice. That's it for Meet the Candidates. We'll see you next time.